Jeff, and what we have here today is a no-name 1960s 15-watt tube amp that I bought in a non-working state about a year or so ago. I managed to bring this back to life, and since then made a few modifications that I feel are improvements to it. As it is now, it's 15 watts, fixed bias amp with two 6v6 output tubes. It has bias modulating tremolo similar to a Princeton Reverb. It's got a transformerless reverb circuit and has a simple L-Pad Attenuator that takes it from about 15 watts down to about 1 watt. So let me play a little bit for you and you can get an idea of what it sounds like. Then after that we can talk a little bit more about what this amp was like when I got it, what I've done to it, and where it is today. So I bought this amp off of Facebook Marketplace relatively cheaply because the previous owner said it wasn't working. So I brought it home and plugged it in, and sure enough, as soon as you turn it on, it would just howl. I narrowed down the issue to the negative feedback circuit, so I don't know if someone monkeyed around with it or replaced the output transformer and had the polarity reversed, but as soon as I disconnected the negative feedback circuit, it worked fine. So at that point, the amp was working, but it was kind of blah. There's no reverb on this amp, or there wasn't when I got it, and I like amps with reverb. So the first thing I set about doing was seeing if I could put a transformerless reverb circuit into this amp. I put these into a lot of the amps that I built from scratch. It's very simple. It's one tube, no transformer, and it gives you some nice reverb that, for the simplicity, you just can't beat it. So not knowing the specs on the power transformer, I took the safest route and swapped out the 6x5 rectifier for a couple of diodes, and that ensured that the additional tube wouldn't stress the power supply. The reverb only draws about 10 to 12 milliamps of the B+ and 300 milliamps on the heaters, so it might have been fine with the old rectifier in there, but I wanted to play it safe. And 6x5s aren't generally known as the greatest rectifiers anyway, so I didn't see the conversion to solid-state rectification as a big loss in this case. The tremolo actually worked when I bought the amp once I got the amp running, but it wasn't great. Both the range and intensity were a little lacking. The amp was cathode biased, and the tremolo modulated the bias on those two output tubes, similar to the way Gibson did it on some of their old 60s amps. It works, but it doesn't work that great, especially on a push-pull amp. So my favorite tremolo is from a Princeton Reverb, where it oscillates fixed biased on the output tube. So I decided to try that out. I switched the cathode bias over to a fixed bias, and I really liked it. The tremolo sounds great. There's a lot of range, a lot of depth, and I think it's an improvement for sure. phase inverter in this amp is a little different than what you'd see in most guitar amps of this time or any time. It's what's called a Williamson phase inverter, and it looks similar at first glance to something like a Princeton Reverb, where there's a gain stage followed by a cathode phase inverter. But in this case, these two halves of the triode are directly coupled and not capacitively coupled. It looks like these phase inverters were mostly used in the old days back in hi-fi amps, and I'm guessing they were trying to go for something like that on this amp, since it was a bass amp slash guitar amp. I left it alone. I thought about changing it to something more traditional, but then I kind of wanted to leave this amp and at least have some of its original character left in there. So I left it alone. If whoever buys this amp wants to change that out to something more along the lines of what you'd see in, say, a brown Princeton from the early 60s, we could certainly do that. It would be very easy, a couple of components, but for now I left it as it is. The last change I made to this amp was adding a low power switch to bring the output down to about 1 watt. It's just a simple 2 resistor L-Pad, and it does kill some of the highs, but you can crank those back up and you can still get a pretty good sound at much lower volume. The original can capacitor on this amp was already gone by the time I got it. There were some large replacements in there that were sort of haphazardly installed. I took those out and just completely redid the power supply. Looking at this amp, whoever designed it did pretty much everything completely the opposite of what generally accepted best practices are for making a quiet amp. First, the input here is right next to the power section, and the outputs are all the way on the other side. In addition to that, the filaments are wired in that cheap 60s way of tying one side directly to ground, so you have no chance of a center tap, and the filaments started with the preamp tube and ended at the power tubes, which normally you'd want that the other way around. Also, there's grounds pretty much all over the amp wherever they felt it was convenient. And despite this, it wasn't intolerably noisy. I've done a few things to try and make it a little better. There's still a little heater hum, but it's reasonable. It's not the worst I've ever heard, for sure. I did end up rerouting the filament string so it hits the 6v6s first and the preamp and reverb tube last. I left the one side of the filament tied to ground. Thought about changing it, but in order to do that I would need to change out the lamp fixture, because that has one side tied to ground also. You would need to get a different style that has 2 isolated leads on it. So again, there is a small amount of hum with this amp, and if whoever buys it from me wanted me to redo it and try and eliminate that, it's certainly possible, but I didn't go that far on this one. If I'm playing relatively quietly in a quiet room, I have it on the 1 watt setting, in which case that hum is not audible at all. So one thing we haven't talked about is the size of this amp. For a 15 watt, 12-inch speaker amp, this is a big boy. Much bigger than it really needs to be, but I kind of like it. It's fun to play when you're standing up because the knobs are easy to reach. They're right there. The top is flat. There's no the handles on the side, so you can put stuff on top. It's growing on me some. When I bought this, not only was the grill cloth covered by some black fabric, but it also had an emblem from an old car on it, a Mercury emblem. Since there's already amps out there called Mercury's, I figured that's no good. So I had this emblem also from an old car, and I like it much better. This amp is now just the sedan, because really that's kind of what this is. It's nothing fancy, it's big, it's boxy, but it's going to get you where you need to go. And so I believe this amp is a sedan. So let me know what you think about the changes I made to this amp. Should I have left it alone? Do you think it's okay? Personally, I think it's in a better place to get use in today's world. The tremolo is better, it's got reverb, and it does have its own unique sound. And like I said, there are things we could do to make this a little more normal, but I kind of like the way it is.